Hello and welcome to Ullapool. Well, sadly, not Ullapool, but my house. Um, I'm going to guess that, like you and me and everybody else, we've been looking forward to over the last year, focusing throughout this pandemic, this terrible pandemic year, on the second weekend of May, and that pivotal time for all of us, the Ullapool Book Festival. And sadly, both last year and this year, uh, that hasn't happened, and that's why I'm not there. I have to say, as this welcome address from the honorary president of the Ullapool Book Festival, I have to say my honorary presidency has must be the most troubled and troublesome in the entire UBF history. However, I think that even given the fact that we can't be together this year in Ullapool, doesn't mean to say that we're not going to have a fantastic celebration of books and reading and a great Ullapool Book Festival. I mean, in a sense, writers and readers weren't really supposed to be together. I mean, it's all about it. What's so fascinating that we can read people from many miles away and many centuries apart and still feel the connection. Right now, I'm working on a text in Satire of the Three Estates, written 470 years ago, and yet I feel this connection with David Lindsay. But in Ullapool, we do love being together. We do love walking around the streets of Ullapool and going down to the Cayley Place and of course the scones and chatting about who we've listened to and what we've heard. And in a sense, I think that can keep on going. And in one sense, better even than usual. This is going to be another great Ullapool Book Festival. Joan and the team have gone out their way to make it as Ullapool as possible. And it's as rich and as deep and as varied as it always is. There's Gaelic poetry, there's music, there's poetry from Ayrshire, there's crime from today, the here and now, and from the Victorian era. There's travel writing, there's political writing, there's history. There's all those conversations that we have every year in Ullapool about who we are, where we've been, and where we're going. And this year, although we don't have that one special weekend in the second weekend of May, we are going to be together every Wednesday night, right through spring, right through summer, into August. So in one sense, that's really special. And I'm kind of so looking forward to all that. And this is quite a special spring and summer, hopefully at the end of which the world will look in a more recognisable shape and we can look forward to 2022.
Welcome to the Cayley Place in Ullapool. My name is Mark Renge. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this session, another session from this year's online Ullapool Book Festival, trying to bring it to you as close as possibly we can to the normal experience here in the cosy surrounds of the Cayley Place and in Ullapool. And it's also a huge pleasure for me to be enjoying the privilege of being joined to talk today to Ambrose Parry, who is, I don't know what the right grammar is there, who are, of course, the joint authors of the Way of All Flesh series of gynecological Gothic Edinburgh mystery, as much of the gynecological gore of the horrors of 19th century Edinburgh as you could wish for. They are, of course, Christopher Brookmyre and Marissa Heitzman. Christopher Brookmyre, you will know, I'm sure, as the author of, I think it's 26 novels, is it, Chris?
In total, yeah.
I was counting, I thought, is it 26? Yeah, it's 26. Including some really memorable titles, some really fun titles, such as The Attack of the Unsinkable Rubber Ducks, of course, and A Big Boy Did It and Ran Away, and so many other really brilliant fun titles. But also the winner and multiple times nominee for the William McIlvanney Prize, and the holder of 2 honorary doctorates as well. He is husband and writing partner to Marissa Hetzman, who is a consultant anaesthetist and who has also, for a master's, studied the history of medicine, which comes in really useful in this series. Put the two together and you have the gruesome horrors, as I said, of mid-19th century Edinburgh becoming addictive good reads. Today we're going to be talking about the first 2 books in particular in the series, The Way of All Flesh and The Art of Dying, and I'm hoping we'll have something to say about another instalment in the series which is going to be out very soon. So please virtually welcome Ambrose Parry, Chris Brookmeyer and Marissa Hetzman. Thank you for being here.
Well, it's a pleasure.
It's a pleasure to be anywhere but home.
So this series, we're introduced in The Way of All Flesh to Sarah Fisher and Will Raven, who are 2 principal protagonists through the series, and a whole host of real historical characters like James Young Simpson and so on. We're in 1847 in the first book, and we move on a little bit through time, through historical events. It strikes me that one of the great things about setting in Edinburgh in that period is that you can go to Edinburgh and it's all still visible, it's all still there. You can imagine yourself right in the middle of this without any trouble at all.
Yeah. I think it's a huge benefit as writers of historical fiction to be able to do that. There's so much of the old town is as it was in the 19th century, and so it's really helpful when you're trying to kind of conjure up these descriptions. Obviously, the sewers are now closed over and the smell is much better, but the buildings themselves are there for you to look at. That was really helpful.
I think it helps pull people in as well if they're visitors to a city that they've read about, and they can go there and see the places that you've conjured up, because there's something quite disappointing when you've read about a place in historical fiction and you go there now in the modern day, it's just glass and concrete and you can barely work out where things were, whereas in Edinburgh it's all right there, exactly as you described. And you find that's quite inspiring to be able to walk those streets and think about how it looked to your character. I mean, you still get it all wrong though. I mean, we had I think we had a maternity who was in the wrong place.
Not all
Not
wrong.
wrong, the occasional thing wrong. You know?
Yes. But one of the things that also, apart from Edinburgh being a very historically intact city, I have to acknowledge the fact that the National Library of Scotland has an amazing archive of maps of the time.
And you have a map in the front of it. I love a book with a map in the front of it.
Well, the maps are incredible. You can go into, you can, scroll in, go zoom in, and the most amazing amount of detail. And there's one map in particular from about 1850, an Ordnance Survey map, that highlights all the little nooks and crannies of the old town, and you get such an amazing feel for what it was like. So that the changes that are there in the 21st century, so the things you might miss, you can kind of make up for by looking at the maps. It's incredible. It's an incredible resource.
Hey, or you find a perspective on it that you wouldn't have had ordinarily. And things like there's an old railway tunnel going down under the new town.
Yes,
but also I remember when we were writing The Way of All Flesh, there's a scene where Raven goes down to Leith at night and he's coming back in the dark. And when I looked at the map, it really struck me that, I mean, we used to live just off Leith Walk. And Leith Walk is a really bustling place. There's so much business going on around it. But back then, there would be a wee cluster of houses at a crossroads and then a long stretch of nothing, just fields either side. We realised that at that time that would have meant it would be pitch black at night. There'd be no street lights. There'd only be some lighting maybe at those. So it makes it more atmospheric, more scary, but you're thinking about the implications for your character navigating those streets at that time. But yeah, as Marissa says, the map resources from the National Library are just indispensable. And I do remember we were doing an event with another historical author, Oscar de Muriel, who also writes about Victorian Edinburgh. And he hadn't actually been here very often. He was from Mexico, but he was talking about coming up here on a kind of research trip.
Up to Edinburgh.
Up to Edinburgh on a research trip, and he had whatever he was trying to find, he only had a map from the mid-19th century, but he showed it to the bus driver and was like, "Oh, it's right there, pal." because very little had changed in the layout.
Yeah, indeed. And of course, the new town, which when the book opens, and Newtown's still pretty fresh. It's not that old at that stage. Which, I mean, it's a gift for that Jekyll and Hyde contrast between poor, hard life, old town Edinburgh, no longer the mixed city of all classes, and Newtown, prosperous, polite society Edinburgh, with all of its intrigues under the behind the twitching curtains and so on. So that's a real gift to you. And of course, action takes place across these and down to Leith as well.
Yeah, I think one of the things that drew us to Simpson in the first place was that he is someone who kind of transcends those divisions. Even though his house is in the new town, he was someone who moves comfortably in the different social strata of Edinburgh at the time. And it is very stratified, and there is lots of division in terms of the geographic division from going over to the new town at that point. And it's very significant for Raven to have left. He thinks he's arrived because he's literally gone from the life in the old town to life in the new town. And that's why the first thing we did to him was have Simpson take him straight back across to the old town on his first day. But Simpson, that was one of the reasons we talked about writing this in the first place, was the stories you were telling.
Yeah. It was fascinating to me because in Victorian society, I think depictions of Victorian society, well, to my mind, it was very much the kind of middle classes or aspiring middle classes lived in very kind of staid situations where the father was head of the household and in charge of everyone else, and everyone was very deferential, and it was all very strict and uptight. And Simpson's house, when you read the descriptions of what it was like there, was chaos. It was just incredibly chaotic. Apparently the children ran about the place. They weren't consigned to the nursery upstairs. He saw patients in the downstairs public rooms. They were all always his clinics were always very oversubscribed, so there were patients spilling out and sitting on the stairs and everything. And he used to invite people to lunch and dinner on a whim without telling the domestic staff. He used to come out of his bedroom in the morning, and the newspapers that he had read first thing, he just dropped them over the side of the banister and let them float down to the downstairs hall because he had so many books to carry. It was just this incredible piece of drama, wasn't it? I remember telling you about it and you were like, this would be an amazing setting for a book. That and the fact that he looked after aristocrats, members of the royal family, and then, fishwives from Newhaven. And they all came through the doors at Queen Street. So we just thought this is an amazing setting.
I think that there is a wee line in the new book, without giving anything away, where Simpson is going to go and administer to royalty, and we're told that, that's a privilege for the prince.
Yes.
Which was a wonderful line, I thought. Yeah. Simpson's a fascinating character. And he's and again, in amongst all that chaos that's going on for clinics, which you really depict very, very well in the books, there's the chaos of him experimenting with what the new anesthesia is going to be, and dropping around the dining table and so on. I mean, you must have had a great deal of fun researching that.
I think it was a huge amount of fun. There's just so much material, isn't there? But the reason that we set The Way of All Flesh in 1847, and it had to be then and no other time, was because Simpson and his associates discovered the anaesthetic effects of chloroform sitting round the dining room table one November evening, sniffing various chemicals they had procured from the chemistry laboratory at the university. And they had been doing this all summer. And they had been sniffing all manner of toxic things and making themselves quite unwell in the process. And they had hit upon chloroform. And apparently the little sample they had been stuck at the back of a cupboard because it looked very kind of thick and viscous and they didn't think it would be very volatile. So they had discarded it. But they had run out of things to sniff. They dug this out from the back of the cupboard, started inhaling it, and then the next thing they knew, they were all under the table. Now, you might think they thought, this is fantastic, this is what they've been looking for. But I guess in modern times, because science is very kind of laboratory-based and it's white coats and ethics committees and so on, what happened after they discovered chloroform was they invited everyone else in the house into the dining room, made everyone sniff it until they all passed out, and kept going until there was nothing left. So that the party went on till about 3 a.m. And you just think, that's really not the kind of how I would have imagined it.
Immediately abusing it for recreational effects
Yeah.
in a very Scottish way.
Yes, and Simpson was notorious for getting ether and chloroform out at the end of dinner parties to kind of liven things up a bit.
It was his party piece.
It was, absolutely.
And also that we're talking about the sort of modern practice of discovering something and then testing it. Back then, Simpson made the discovery on, was like a Tuesday or a Sunday, what day, I can't remember, but within 3 days he was administering it to everybody in hospital.
In patients in their home. It was some people would say he was a little rash. He didn't wait, but I think in his mind this was such a phenomenal discovery, and he was all about getting rid of the unnecessary pain that people were suffering, that he wasted no time and started giving it to patients immediately.
Well, rash, I'm sure, a woman who knew that absolute agony was facing her, was only too delighted to give it a try.
Absolutely.
And Simpson, I mean, we know him for chloroform, but that wasn't his only achievement.
No.
There were more.
Far from it. In fact, even after the discovery of chloroform, which was a great advance on ether, because ether was quite hard to manage, he never stopped. He was interested in so many things, and he was always about progress and pushing things forward, and he was always getting into bother with his surgical contemporaries, because obstetrics and gynecology was an emerging field. And surgeons felt very strongly that anything that required an operation should be in their hands. And Simpson was starting to do stuff on his own. And particularly Professor Syme got very upset about this. There's a great story actually where Simpson wrote a pamphlet about alternatives to surgical sutures. And Syme was absolutely incensed at this, impinging on his territory. That in front of his surgical class, Syme got the pamphlet, ripped it up in front of everyone and tossed it into the surgical remains box where they used to put the bits of body they had hacked off. And this was the sort of thing that went on all the time. They weren't very gentlemanly with each other. They were always fighting with each other, going to court over things that had been said. It's very different to modern medicine, which is fascinating to me.
It was good to hear it is very different to modern medicine, I must say. But yes, if you presume that polite society in Edinburgh is a monolith, a united front. In these books, we find that absolutely they are not. It's a dog-eat-dog world. There's so much nastiness, rivalry, trying to get one over, so much of that, and it comes across.
It was a time when there was reputations to be made and fortunes to be made, and so there's a sense that people had the chance to make themselves almost immortal in terms of the reputation, and also to make fortunes from doing this. So they're going to be at each other's throats, and we wanted to, with the books, look at how that has implications for their conduct. So there's ethical implications of people who are not that fussed about whether people die as a result of their experiments, and also in the second book Raven is actually delighted when he thinks he's discovered a new disease. You know, that people are dying, and he thinks maybe he'll get to name the disease. And it seems quite bleak that you'd want a disease named after you, but at that time it would be a great achievement.
So let's talk a bit about Will Raven. I mean, he's a really interesting character who develops. He's precariously privileged, I suppose you could say. He's well aware that the circumstances he's working his way into are hard won and could easily be lost. He's got a difficult past behind him. He's edgy, but rather naive as well. And I think that's what endears us to him, that he's edgy, but there's a naivety about him. He just doesn't cop on to something straight away.
He's not fully formed. You know, one of the things that we wanted to do from the beginning was write what we used to talk about, this battle for a young man's soul, that he's someone who is potentially going to be seduced by that more mercenary and self-seeking side of medicine, that he's someone who does think, if I get to the new town and get a position, I will have the opportunity to make money, to make a name for myself. And it's our vision was that through his exposure to Simpson, he'd realised that it's all about humanity, and it's about more noble things. But part of that is he's not really had a father figure. So obviously Simpson increasingly provides that role to him. But he is a bit rash and naive, and he's got a tendency to kind of howl at the moon. He enjoys a degree of chaos, and unusually for the characters I write, he likes dispensing violence, and he's quite good at it. And so he kind of doesn't mind getting into fights in the old town, in taverns and things, because he's got this kind of darkness in him, and he doesn't quite understand where it's come from. And that's why we see him as not fully formed, you know, that we want to see how this character develops over and is shaped by the people that he deals with hugely in the case of Simpson, but also Sarah plays a huge part in knocking some of his rough edges off, or also getting him to accept some of his rough edges.
Sarah, of course, is not at all from a privileged background. She's a maid when we meet her first in Simpson's household. But she is absolutely fascinated with the medicine. There's been a lot of interest recently in the first female graduates in medicine in the 1890s, I think it was, from Edinburgh University. But we're talking about 50 years before this.
Yep.
And Sarah is, she wants to be a doctor. And she absolutely has the potential to be one, but she's a maid.
Yeah. I think we were playing with the notion that just because you were a domestic servant, because you had limited educational opportunities, did not mean to say that meant that you were unintelligent. So what happened to the people who were intelligent and interested and curious, who had limited educational opportunities, but all that potential was there? What would happen to someone like Sarah if she did end up in a household like Simpson's, where she might be encouraged to borrow books from the library and read in her spare time, which she wouldn't have had. She wouldn't have had much spare time, to be fair. But it's that curiosity. And if you were exposed to the clinics and watching people work, and if you were exposed to some of the male apprentices who came through who maybe weren't all that great, and you would, I don't know, I just like to play with the notion that perhaps there were women out there who really strained at the leash a wee bit and decided they were going to try and do something more than society was dictating that they were allowed. So it was also important that given that there was a lot of obstetrics in the book, we didn't want the men to be the protagonists and the women to be the kind of victims or the having things done to them by men. We wanted to have one of the protagonists to give a female perspective. So Sarah's been a joy to write, actually. And I think the other thing is, because I studied medicine myself, and I am endlessly curious about diseases and the anatomy of the body, and pickled things in jars don't appall me, they fascinate me. I was just thinking, what that was someone like me who just found the whole thing fascinating. And what would that be like to be in that household and be allowed to kind of be curious? So she's been a huge part of the books, and we're going to kind of, I realise it's still very early in the whole women studying medicine, but we're kind of hoping to work up towards the Edinburgh Seven and the first women to study at Edinburgh and kind of bring that in, but that would be a few books down the lane.
But I think that's what's crucial about Sarah, in that people keep talking about the Edinburgh Seven, and they kind of knocked down the door. But I think it's to say that there had to be women before that who didn't get quite as far, and whose efforts weakened the hinges before they knocked down the door. Yeah, and also the sort of unremarked contributions as well. So, for instance, I think in the next book we're going to write, we're going to bring in Syme's daughter, Syme's daughter, who married Lister, and is believed to have been responsible for a lot more of not responsible for what Lister was credited with, but who had a big role in ultimately what Lister's work, and we kind of have the suspicion that there's an awful lot of that, that was unreported in the medical history of the time. And so Sarah represents that contribution and that constant straining that would have been necessary. So in the third book, Sarah meets Elizabeth Blackwell, who has by this point qualified as a doctor. So it's all about that.
And it's not easy for her to track her down and meet her.
No. Yeah, that's good fun as well. There's so much true historical content in the books, which I don't know. I think it's one of the joys of the project is that you try and pull in all the relevant real historical facts. And I think initially I found that quite difficult to do, having done a history degree where everything has to be factual. You're not allowed to play around with anything that happened. You're not allowed to kind of add to it. In writing a historical novel, the great thing is you're allowed to kind of expand things a little bit. And whenever I'm doing a piece of research and I'll say to Chris, I can't find anything about this one specific area. Initially, I thought this was a problem, but Chris would always say, well, that's great, because then we can fill in the gaps. We can make, educated guesses and kind of expand things a wee bit. And now I've got used to it. It's a huge amount of fun.
But it's also very satisfying when you can take real historical events and incorporate them in a way that gels with the narrative. So it's not just crowbarred in there just for a historical detail. So things like in the third book, a lot of the detail involving Elizabeth Blackwell, that was all true. That these were things that did happen to her. And so we thought, well, let's incorporate as much of that as we can, because I think there's something exciting when you realise that you're able to take real historical events and characters and weave them in so that they enhance your story, or indeed sometimes become crucial to your story.
That was a point that a certain very well-known Scottish critic, who's well-known to Ullapool Book Festival too, didn't like so many genuine Edinburgh historical figures being there, and felt there'd been enough proto-feminism in 19th century Scottish fiction. And I can't agree with him, I have to say. I think he's wrong on that score. But
I get
Edinburgh was a small city, it wasn't big. So when Will Raven is meeting Helen Adamson, photographers and so on, I mean, absolutely, that would happen. It was not a big, sprawling city.
It wasn't just that he might run into them. Simpson was known to them. Simpson's photographed by Helen Adamson, and George Keith, who was Simpson's assistant, was good friends with Helen Adamson. So,
and George Keith was
and a photographer.
It was very much in part of the development of photography in Edinburgh. He was part of a photographic society that he set up with his brother Thomas, who was also a gynaecologist. It's like, as soon as you start reading in any depth about the history of the time, there are all these connections, like Joseph Lister being Syme's son-in-law. You're just like, you just think, oh, I didn't know that. And it's like, he was there. they were all there.
I mean, yeah, it can be kind of cheap sometimes. You read something historical and they've just shoehorned in some kind of character because they were around at that time. But we wouldn't do that. We're to us, the satisfying thing is finding these connections, finding the real people who were there, and especially in Simpson's house. Everybody came through Simpson's door. Elizabeth Blackwell's sister came and worked for Simpson as well. So these are real connections rather than ones that we're just speculatively making.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, when Sarah is finding her way into a corner in medical practice, it's totally believable because she's there, she's assisting, she's being practical, she's called in this chaotic, overflowing household where they're practically beating folk away from the doors to be seen. And there has to be somebody bringing some order into the chaos, which she does.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I think that was another thing that we wanted to give, to show right away that Sarah was someone who would take hold of these kind of chaotic situations in a way that Raven wouldn't, because he at times doesn't know where to put himself in the early days. He's keen to learn, but I guess many young doctors, once they've qualified, they suddenly realise that yes, they've read an awful lot of stuff, but they don't know what to do when you put a patient in front of them for the first time.
And they're expected to be the fount of all wisdom at that point. And he puts his foot in it more than once at the beginning. I'm pleased to hear that you're wanting to bring things right up to the Edinburgh 7, because that means lots more books. There's a point where Simpson, I think, is bowling along as a carriage through the Grange, past the fields. And it's something that an acre of the Grange nowadays, there's going to have to be a lot of outings from Will and Sarah before, if you have ambitions to buy an acre in the Grange. So I'm really pleased that you're continuing, that you've got plans going far ahead with the series. Can we say something about the book that's out very, very shortly, just in a few weeks' time, middle of August, I think it is?
Yep.
A Corruption of Blood. How much do we want to say about it?
Well, we've moved on. We haven't moved on very far from the end of The Art of Dying, which is the second book, which was set in the late 1849, early 1850. So we're now summer 1850, and Sarah wants to try and meet Elizabeth Blackwell, who's recently qualified as a doctor in America, and is doing a tour of Europe. So Sarah kind of tries to track her down because she wants to kind of pick her brain about how she managed to achieve what seems to be so impossible in Scotland. And Will Raven is again pursuing his own kind of ambitions, and they're kind of separate at the beginning of the book. But a very well-to-do and wealthy Edinburgh citizen is found dead in his bed, and strangely, the son is accused of murdering his father, and Will Raven, who knew the son as a medical student, is called in to try and clear his name.
And they have
Much to
history
his
between them
surprise.
as well.
They have history between them. They didn't get on, so
Raven is quite confused that he should be asked, but he thinks he's really only being asked because someone close to him is also close to this individual, and it might be a favour. So there's a lot of complex karma involved in all of that. And there's another area that the book deals with in depth, which is really, again, the lot of women and the attitude towards unwanted children. But we can't really go into that without massive spoilers, because it's, let's just say it was into even darker territory than anything we've done before, which is saying something.
That is saying something, because there's some pretty dark territory in the first two books as well. Also pretty dark territory with the police and with the role of the law. One of the real historical characters, for those who wouldn't know that he was historical might find it hard to believe, McCleavey, the detective, was a real historical character. And he's anyone will do to colour with the crime.
Well, that's interesting, because we read McCleavey left a lot of his notebooks and journals, didn't he, about his life as an Edinburgh detective, and we read those books, and it was interesting because Chris developed this really strong sense of the man from reading his books and his attitude to crime and catching felons and so on. You had this very strong impression that he was like that,
That he was massively corrupt,
Yes.
and also and because he was so self-congratulatory, but and there was elements of something fascinating about the way he would find. He maintained he always got his man and always found the goods that were stolen. And he would explain, and some of it was fascinating, but then there was often, it was almost like an old Grindhouse movie, scene missing, real missing. There was some crucial part of the deductive process that was missing, and it just struck me that he frequently would just pin it on somebody. That he had reason to believe somebody was a wrong'un, and they would do as a candidate for it. And it's interesting the perspectives because he is a kind of disputed figure. I know that Brian Cox plays him on a radio programme that's run for several series, and he's regarded in some figures as some would hold him as a kind of great historical detective, but there is plenty of evidence to suggest that he was regarded as a lot of things that he claimed to have recovered maybe didn't get back to their rightful owner. I think it was just my crime writer instincts. Every case I read of his, I thought, that one might be true, and that one he's just fitted someone up.
So you had a natural cynicism. It wasn't just seeing this as a character who's just
No,
made
this
of
was
hubris.
very much the sense I got of him, that he would be very good at certain elements of the deduction, but also that he would probably at times just take the path of least resistance to get a result. And I thought, well, what would be the implications of that? That he would be a feared figure, therefore. Because if you are in the high echelons of Edinburgh society, he's not going to be a problem for you. He's the guy who'll get your stuff back. But if you're further down...
Maybe in the new book, maybe not.
Maybe not. But Raven is the type of person that knows that he might be the type of individual who get fitted up, if he gets on the wrong side of McLeavy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, McLeavy does come across as a real kind of bullhead character, I think, to me in the book. Even as a reader, you wouldn't want to meet him. Meeting him on the pages is enough. Speaking of pages, how about giving us a wee reading from? Is it from The Art of Dying?
Yes. I'll read from the beginning of The Art of Dying, because The Art of Dying. It was unusual that Marissa came up with it. Not the idea for it. It was more like she discovered another real historical figure, and when she told me the darker truths about this individual, I was saying immediately, "Oh, this is our plot. This is our villain." It's one of those things you would just assume it was made up because it's so dark and so horrific, but it's all true. Obviously, we've moved a few things around, but this is from the point of view of our villain, and this is how the book opens. There is not a woman in this realm who does not understand what it is to be afraid. No, not even she who reigns over us, for she was not born sovereign. She was born a girl, and that is why I can be sure that even she has known the fear and the helplessness of being subject to man's dominion. Every woman has felt the fear that derives from her own weakness before men whose greater power derives from a stature that is not merely physical. Many men have held power over me. They were not great men. Oftentimes they were not even strong men. For in this world you need to be neither of those things to exercise your will upon the weak and helpless, or at least upon those who have come to believe that they are weak and helpless. In my life I have learned much about treachery and deceit. But surely the cowardliest trick of all is that of persuading someone that they have no power when you know the opposite to be true. In order to survive, it is thus vital that a woman should learn to assuage her fear. She must recognise and harness her power, but this must be done with subtlety, without intimidation, without overt threat. It is the lot of remarkable women that the world will not know our names, that we might not take the true plaudits for our achievements, though they outstrip the deeds of men. We must exercise our power unseen. As women, We may not venture forth alone beyond the dusk, but I do not speak of time when I suggest that we must operate in the twilight. I speak of the interstices, the places in between darkness and light, the blind spots in men's vision. You wish to know how I could have done what I did, how I could have taken so many lives without arousing the merest suspicion? The answer lies within yourselves. It is easy to hide in the plain sight of those who do not consider your presence worthy of notice.
I remember reading that when I first, in fact, I'd read The Art of Dying, I think, before The Way of All Flesh. And I remember reading that piece right at the beginning of the book and feeling catapulted into what was to follow in the rest of the book. Almost the hair is going up on the back of your neck, ready to see, wow, where is this going? That's a great opening, I think, there.
Where it was going was, Marissa's notion was that one of the assumptions in Victorian society was always that the women were without agency, for good or ill. Mm-hmm. And so they were literally beyond suspicion. The angel of the household, if it was a mother, and in this case a nurse. Based on real historical cases, she's had the idea that, well, a nurse could commit terrible crimes and nobody would have any idea about it. But at the same time, as this folded into another true story, the fact that Simpson had been accused of negligence resulting in the death of a patient, and we wanted Raven and Sarah to look into that. Again, a real case with all the bizarre details, including people chasing down the mattress. This was all true as well, to investigate the mattress where the blood was found, this kind of thing. But we just thought, well, what if the real explanation was that somebody else was offing the patients?
Because the nurse is not quite what we think she is at the beginning, without saying anyway, but no spoilers on that for those who haven't read The Art of Dying yet. It really sets you up to be ready for the sinister as you open the book there in The Art of Dying. You're obviously enjoying writing the series if you're now planning to reach the 1890s step by step, at least. About how you write. I'm sure that there'll be lots of readers who will look at the blurb at the back and see Marissa Haitzman, consultant anaesthetist, Christopher Brookmeyer. Right, so Marissa is a historical consultant and Chris writes the books. That's not how you work, is it?
No, I mean, it's a bit of an evolving process, isn't it? I think initially we thought that I would provide the research material and Chris would write the novel. But we kind of realised that it's more complicated than that you can't really just dump someone with a whole mass of historical detail and expect them to come up with a book incorporating a lot of it. It was quite a complicated business. And we found that we, added to the fact that you write your own books too, so we've kind of evolved the process so that I do a lot of the background research and outline some ideas for the plot and how the novel should be, usually try and discover who the villain is, based on largely real historical events and characters. And then Chris will come on board and turn it into a proper crime story and complicate things and add subplots. And then we write it together, don't we? In fact, in A Corruption of Blood, we found that Chris would kind of go out for long walks and kind of loosely structure chapters and come back and give them to me, and I would write them up, and then he would kind of move on to the next section. So it's been a kind of evolving process, but we both do write it.
I think there's areas where I realised that Marissa's perspective was going to be crucial, especially in The Way of All Flesh. Her perspective as an anaesthetist, as a doctor, would be completely different to anyone else looking at the same events, the same ideas. That she would view this through informed eyes and know where drama lay that other people would miss. So it was important that she just tell the story and a lot of the time, and that evolved throughout the book. So we've now got to the stage where there's sometimes I'll think there's a section that she should write entirely on her own because I know her perspective on it is going to be more valuable than what I would bring to it. And there's other times where I'll just map out where I'd like it to go and give that to Marissa while I work out the next thing, and that became very efficient in the last book. But what we tend to do is once we've worked on separate things, we'll swap over and rewrite each other's, and I think we've become quite practiced at kind of ventriloquizing each other. You know, we both have a sense of how the other would write something, and so I think we're both trying to imitate each other's styles, and as a result of that, we both end up with a similar style.
And we always say, and I think this is true, that when we reread what we've written, we can't always remember who came up with what idea and who wrote what. Although I always add to that sometimes when we get editorial notes, or certainly with The Way of All Flesh, we got some editorial notes, and there were some of the text that's just highlighted in yellow, and we weren't sure what that meant. And we asked the editor, and he said, "Oh, they're just bits that I really like." And so we started going through the book edits, and anything that was highlighted in yellow, I was like, "Yeah, that was me. That was me," claiming all the good stuff.
The thing is if I try and take something on my own with regard to this, it is fraught with danger because I'll just try and make something up, and Marissa will come in. We're writing a chapter in The Corruption of Blood, and I'd swapped it over, and she came down and she said, "Is the piece involving someone who's got a rudimentary prosthetic limb?" And she said, "Did you research this?" And I just had to kind of, I didn't even get to answer. My expression said it all, which was no, I just made it up. So she had to change it. So the technology wasn't there for, like, I had some notion of some kind of
Articulated?
no, just metal. And you were saying, no, that wouldn't have happened, so it had to be wood.
But if I remember right, it's a beautifully carved bit of wood, intricately designed bit of wood.
Yes, anatomically correct.
Well, I thought if it was a doctor, it would probably be anatomically correct.
Which I suppose fits it entirely with the Victorian aesthetic, to have it that way. Right at the beginning of the new one, we're in Leith, right at the beginning. I just happened a couple of days ago to see a photograph of the harbour in Leith from that very period, and just realised actually how different Leith looks around the harbour, just the boats there. But there really is a sense, and in an earlier adventure where Will is chasing around Leith as well, trying to get his woman, there's a real frisson to Leith then. Leith has become somewhat sanitised now. Didn't feel it then.
No, I think as well as the photograph you refer to, there's a painting by, I think it was David Octavius Hill, the photographer, because he was a landscape artist. But there's a great painting of the port of Leith around that time too, and it's all just masts and sails and obviously teeming with people from all parts of the world. It's so I thought the contrast to the kind of genteel Edinburgh and the harbour down in Leith, I thought that was quite interesting, and it's so different from the Leith that we know today. Even though there's lots of really ancient old buildings still in Leith, it would have been very different then.
Yeah, you really get that sense of it when you read it. That they're just a different character to the city of Edinburgh at the time, which doesn't occur to us now, I suppose, in that sense. Maybe Leith has changed in appearance more than central Edinburgh.
Quite possibly.
And well, its character will have altered because it's no longer such an important shipping centre, whereas at the time it would have been crucial, you know, as a passenger port as well as a freight port. So we wanted to reflect that it does have this different colour to it, sometimes literally different colour to it, because there's going to be so many different nationalities and ethnicities there that wouldn't necessarily filter back into central Edinburgh. Things like in the third book, there's this suggestion of a housemaid that she's of a slightly more exotic hue because our father would have been a sailor. Was partly inspired by the fact that I remember my dad rewiring houses in Port Glasgow in the 1970s, and he said it was all full of Filipino children. And it was because of boats that put in at Port Glasgow, and the Filipino sailors had impregnated lots of the local girls. So, and I thought, well, that's the sort of thing that would have gone on at the time. This would have led to a far more kind of interesting kind of ethnic melting pot in a place like Leith than just up the hill in the new town.
So many more things I'd like to be able to talk about the moral and religious aspects that are encountered in the book, the controversies, the belief at the time that it was biblically ordained that childbirth must involve pain. And so many things we could talk about, but our time is about up. So again, can I thank you, Ambrose Parry, Marissa Hitzman, and Christopher Brookmeyer for being with us in Ullapool. It's middle of August when A Corruption of Blood is out, is
Yep.
it?
The 19th, I think it is. 19th.
Yeah.
So please look out for it. If you haven't already read The Way of All Flesh and The Art of Dying, then they are indeed available. Indeed, if you're quick in the bookshop here in Ullapool, there will be an author-handled copy of The Art of Dying available to purchase if you're very quick after this goes out. But for now, thank you very much, and my thanks to the whole team at Ullapool for organising in such a successful way these sessions instead of our annual gathering in the flesh. I hope we can all be together again in Ullapool with audience to ask the questions at the end of the session this time. But thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
On the edge of the West. Beneath the wilds of the Fanichs, the Jiri, Bengola, Ullapool, Cooridin Sanctuary.
Where the skies rise further, where the heather scores the west, Summer Isles, Hebrides.
These houses painted white, a metropolis whose streets you can count on your fingers, and the pier, its tongue stuck out, licking salt from the air.
Here are friendly, welcoming people. Fish suppers, a ferry black and white, flapping flag, silver sparkle, coconut broom.
Here, it's the scale of what blows through you as the wind burls the islands, sieving winter's thoughts from our heads.
And all along Market Street, the bloom of cherry blossom, making a Japan of Ullapool.